This video covers chapter 17 of Suburani really quickly. Going to talk about some cultural and grammatical highlights. Main idea being we're set in Pompeii. We're focusing on the various smells of people, of animals, of bread, of wine, of fooleries, of perfumes, of spices, all these different smells that come up in chapter 17 and the businesses that sell those things and create those smells. Pompeii is plural, Pompeii. It's like the Pompeii, kind of like Green Hills or something. And so grammatically, it's always going to get plural endings. And in this chapter, we're also going to cover a new past tense. It appears right away. So it'll be our third past tense and our fifth of the 6 tenses that exist in Latin. And having another past tense is going to enable us to tell stories in multiple time frames and combine and make our sentences a lot more detailed if we're sequencing events in the past. So let's look at some examples. In Urbe Pompeiis, there's that plural ending. Servus parvus pistrino proxima, that's either dative or ablative, and then I see my verb appropriquabat, so it's definitely dative. He was approaching or drawing near to the nearest pistrinum. Prima lux erat. Duo servos, not the subject because they're accusative, and an asinum, also not the subject because he's accusative. So all of these are the object, the 2 slaves and a donkey. In pistrino conspexit, there's my subject and verb. He spotted in the bakery. He caught sight of duo servos and a donkey in the bakery. The servi, relative clause, but they're not the subject of the relative clause. Quos conspexerat, and then finishing out about the servi. They were working hard, but what slaves? The slaves quos conspexerat, whom he had spotted, were working hard. A femina fessa, there she is, panem faciebat, was making, vendebatque, and vendebating panem. The panis, quem antea fecerat, which object she had already made or which she had previously made was still warm now. If sentences with relative clauses are tricky, you can ignore the relative clause and just do the main clause. The bread was still warm now. The slaves were working hard. So then you fill in, well, what about the bread? Oh, the bread which she had made. What about the slaves? The slaves whom he had spotted. And so we get this dude's kind of day in his life. This servus, whoever he is, he emited some panem and domum redire coipit. In the wheaties, a bunch of Pompeians, aquam e fontibus traheban, and there they were, drawing their water. But he, domum rediit, returned home, where aquam e fistula traxit, where he drew water from a pipe. The aqua quam traxera, I can ignore that, era frigida, the water was cold. What water? The water which he had drawn. So that's our new past tense that you're seeing there. Remember that we've learned that, well, there are 6 tenses in Latin. We've covered 4 up to this point. 3 come from this guy, the present stem, the second principal part minus re, the present tense, neko, nekos, nekat, using that nekos stem, the imperfect tense, nekabam, nekabos, nekabat, using that nekos stem, and the future tense, nekabo, bis, bit, bimis, bitis, bunt. We also know that the perfect tense comes from the third principal part, or the perfect stem. So we got nekav, and then e isti it, imis istis erunt, so nekawi, nekawisti, nekawit. We also know that the imperfect tense is like was verbing. It's a past tense where I'm focusing on when it was happening, like not focusing on the incompletion of it, because perfect means complete. So perfect was my past tense if somebody has done it or they did it. So walked or has walked were both of our translations for the perfect tense. In this case, killed or I have killed, you have killed, he has killed, or I killed, you killed, he killed, using this verb. Well, this guy that just showed up in this chapter, we saw conspexit, that's third principal part plus e isti it, that's perfect tense. We translated it as he spotted, and we translated this one as he had spotted. That's our new tense. It's the same stem, conspex, from the third principal part, but instead of using e isti it, we're using eram, eras, erat. These are in OneNote for Unit 2, but I went ahead and added in this new tense called the pluperfect tense. The pluperfect tense is going to use, I guess I chose the wrong color to highlight, is going to use that same stem that the perfect tense used. We're going to use the third principal part, and instead of e isti it, imis istis erunt, we're going to add eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratus, erant. So you'd get like nekaweram, nekaweras, nekawerat, or conspexeram, conspexeras, conspexerat. Pluperfect means more past, more completed. So I'm talking about an action that happened before this one. I had done something before I did this. So we've got a past tense now that means had verbed, one that we already had that meant has or have verbed, and then we had a was or were verbing. So just sequencing our tenses, getting a little bit more detail here and combining sentences. The slave did something to the bread, which apistore emerat, which he had emerated from the pistor. What did he do with the bread? In mensa reliquit. He left it on the table. Again, if the relative clause makes the sentence tricky, ignore it for a second and look at the main clause. The slave left the bread on the table. What bread? The bread which apistore emerat, which he had bought from the baker. So read through these stories, look for those different past tenses, look at those relative clauses. There's some new vocab, again, about sense, about life in the city, some good adjectives that appear here, but a lot of old vocab too, are set in a big villa, it looks like. And this Serwis is a familiar character from earlier in Suburani chapters. His name's Kurax. His mother, worked in the Subura, as did he, and she was enslaved, so he was also enslaved. Well, his mother saved this man, Gisco's baby, Atto, from the great fire in Rome, and so he freed this guy's mother, Portilla, for that. He freed her for saving his son, but he still is the dominus of this kid. So that's a complicated, like, well, you freed his mother, but you didn't let him go with her, is a little interesting. But that, new characters otherwise happening here in Pompeii, but old characters who have relocated from Rome to Pompeii. There's the kid Kurax again. It looks like he's going to a deserted house, an empty house. Looks like a famous house in Pompeii. And as you read through this story, it's a pretty good story. He looks at the artwork in the triclinium. I think there's a story about Theseus. There's this weird dude who says things like, "Winam nonam foram wakuam emere wolo." He's like yelling at the kid and then laughing after the kid leaves. There's a joke of sorts or a trick that he's pulling here. So as you read through that story, look for that. You don't need to read the notes on the domus because we know the parts of a Roman house, but you can read it if you want. There's, of course, notes on the pluperfect tense, how to form it, how we translate it, comparing it to the present, and then our other two past tenses. So looking at all of those side by side. A good story about being in a fulonica, so there's probably some smells there. Again, a lot of good adjectives happening. Kurax, however, was tired. The sun was calidus. Slaves were doing something with vestimenta sordida, which we know is what occurs in a fulonica. They were probably cleaning them. Oh yeah, there it is. They were temptabanting to lavare, where slaves were, actually, that's in a relative clause. I'm going to ignore that. Slaves were doing something with dirty clothing. Ignore the relative clause. They were trampling in tubs. Remember, you can click on these words. So trampling in like bathtubs. They were trampling dirty clothing. What dirty clothing? Dirty clothing which they were attempting to wash. So again, some good stories, some good practice of vocab. There's a picture of the remains of a real fullery in Pompeii. This story has good smells in it. In the harbor of the city, that girl Julia that we saw in the picture in the first story was standing. And then multos odores, that's not my subject, it's my object. Probably she was smelling many odors of the mare genitive, of fishes genitive, of garum genitive, of dirty people genitive. There it is. She was smelling the many odors of all those things. And she recited, she smiled or laughed because she's happy about this boat that's coming into port. Julia, something about a letter to her brother who was living in Egypt. Where's my verb? Oh, she had written. She had scripturated an epistulam to her fratrem, who in Aegypto habitabat. And what else? And she had asked for multa aromata, just like emblemata, neuter plural. She had asked for a bunch of spices, and now this nawis, which iter longum transmare figure, which had made a long journey over the sea, what was the ship doing? It was ferrebotting a parwam arcam full of aromatum. It was bringing a small box full of spices. And so then Gisco, it looks like she has maybe she goes to the bar, has a conversation with Gisco. He mentions unguentum, which we can translate as perfume. So there's some good smells mentioned here. And it's a funny story as well, or at least kind of clever. You can read about making perfume in the ancient world. Another story called Familia Ampliati. So there's a character named Ampliatus. You can do the language practice, choose the pluperfect and translate. Gisco did something to Quartilla, who had saved his son. Oh, he had happily freed Quartilla, who had saved his son. The house and the land, those are both the direct object. Sadly, pluperfect, we had left behind, or we had sadly abandoned our house and our land, our villa and our land. So that maybe that's talking about Gisco having to relocate from the Subura to now living in Pompeii. Who knows? So find the pluperfect tense verbs. They're easy to spot. They're easy to translate. Putting them into the sentence makes it a little harder, but definitely work on those. This one, I'm not super worried about adverbs, but let's look at your quiz. So in the quiz, the first section, you're combining sentences with different past tense verbs using a relative clause and a pluperfect tense verb. And they get kind of harder as you go because they give you less help with each one. Curax spotted 2 slaves. The slaves were working hard. So they're the commonality. So I'm going to want to start with them. The slaves were working hard. What slaves? The slaves whom, that's the direct object, it's going to be whom Curax had spotted. And it's easy to think of these in English just as much as in Latin. So I'm just taking that conspex stem and putting that eram, eras, erat ending on there for pluperfect. Femina fessa panem fecit, so a tired lady made bread etiam nunc erat calidus. Again, from the story, the bread was still warm now. So bread is the commonality. That's what I'm going to want to start with. The bread was still warm now. What bread? The bread which, direct object, and it's masculine. So I'm going to use the masculine accusative ending, which the tired lady not made, but I'm going to take that stem and make it erat, which the tired lady had made was still warm now. But then you got to do them all on your own. Curax drew water from the pipe. The water was cold. So water's going to be my commonality. I'm probably going to say the water which Curax had drawn from the pipe was cold. So, which, direct object, feminine, Curax, I don't know, from the pipe. I'm just borrowing all this stuff here, but instead of trox it, I'm going to say trox erat, and then finish it out. Erat frigida. The water which Curax had drawn from the pipe was cold. Curax placed an amphora in the street. The amphora was full of urine. Again, amphora is my commonality. So probably the amphora which Curax had placed in the street was full of urine. So accusative, because the direct object, which Curax in posu, not posu it, but posu erat, and then again, just borrowing from this, plena urinae erat, was full of urine. So I'm not really changing a whole lot. I'm just finding the commonality and giving the correct form of the relative pronoun and just changing that verb to the pluperfect. Curax carried wine. Oculatius stole the wine. So wine's my commonality, but it's probably going to make more sense to say Oculatius stole the wine which Curax had carried. So Oculatius, vinum, I'm going to put obstulit at the end. Oculatius stole the wine which Curax had carried. Wine is neuter, so I want quod, qui quod, which Curax, not porta wit, but I'm going to take that stem and say porta verat. Oculatius stole the wine which Curax had carried. He did the carrying before the stealing, so that one's more in the past. You're going to write in Latin something about the smells of ancient Pompeii. Use that worksheet from class the other day because it had like the verb for to give off, like something smells, like this trash can smells. versus olfakia, which is like, yeah, I smell it. And then you're going to have to do a reading and answer questions about it. So definitely review what your various Latin question words are. They're also in OneNote for Unit 3 under question words.